bonsoir, mes amis. J'ai très heureux être ici en France. Quand ma femme achetait le billet d'avion pour France, je pense je voudrais apprendre un peu français. Non, non, non. Je suis Jason Swett. Je suis le hôte de le Code with Jason podcast. Aussi, j'écris articles Ruby on Rails. J'habite aux États-Unis. Quelques personnes ici américaines? Non? Ah, très bon. Bonne personne. Oui. Je veux donner mon talk en français, mais mon français est très suffisant. Alors, now I switch to English. Thank you. Okay, so the topic of tonight's talk is a different way to think about Rails models. And that's obviously kind of vague, so I'll explain what I mean. This is kind of the solution that I've come up with to a certain problem that I've observed in a lot of code bases over the years. So a lot of us have heard the fat model, skinny controllers heuristic, which I think is a good guideline, but it kind of results in a new problem where it's like keep your controllers skinny and your views dumb and your models fat. And so like what that says is have very little code in your controllers, have very little code in your views, and kind of put the code in your models. And the result of that is you have this big accumulation of code in the models. Has anybody else experienced this issue in Rails code bases? Yeah, like almost everybody. Yeah, that happens a lot. And there have been kind of a lot of different responses to this. Right now, service objects are kind of on vogue, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But it's there's this question of like, okay, our models get really bloated over time, and where do we put this code? In the beginning of a project, things are kind of okay. You do your scaffolding, you're building out some CRUD, and everything's nice and tidy because at the beginning of the project, when there's not very much stuff, you can kind of afford for the code not to be very good, and it's not that big of a problem. And also in the beginning, when you're just scaffolding models and stuff like that, you might need to add a has many line, a couple of validations, that kind of thing. There's not a lot of actual meat there. And so again, it's not that big of a problem. But once you're like a year or 2 years or 5 or 10 years into the application, there's a lot more stuff and it's not clear where to put it. Okay, now let's talk about some of the solutions that people have come up with to these problems that I think aren't good, and then we'll talk about what I think is good. So there's what we call service objects, and I might ask for a little audience participation throughout this talk. Can somebody tell me what is a service object? Yeah.
Well, it's a class that describes the process that can happen on your models.
Okay, a class that describes the process that can happen on your models. Okay. Does anybody else have a different definition? Yeah.
It's kind of similar, but you usually have a call method on this.
Oh yeah, the service objects usually have a call method. Okay. Yeah.
I would just say it's a polo object in the service folder.
A Poro, a plain old Ruby object.
Yes, in the service folder, app service folder.
In the app services folder. Yeah.
It's usually a class or a module that handles a specific part of business logic.
A class or a module that handles a certain type of business logic. Okay. Okay. Yeah, so we've touched on this a little bit already. What you'll find if you read up on what you'll find on service objects is that there are overlapping definitions, but not everybody thinks of a service object as being the same thing. And it's kind of a concept that's, well, not everybody agrees on what it is, so it's hard to talk about. Like, is it a plain old Ruby object? Because that's like the broadest thing possible, you know? That's equivalent to saying a service object is an object. And like an object is the broadest construct you could possibly have, pretty much. So that's like not very meaningful. And then the other equally common, maybe even more common conception of a service object is that it's this kind of, I can't help but describe it in kind of a disparaging way, but it's kind of procedural code wrapped in an object. That's kind of how I see it. And you have that call method. And there's actually a different name for that. It's the command pattern. And so a lot of people, when they refer to service objects, they're referring to what I call the command pattern, which I think is a better way to refer to these types of objects, is a command object. So there's those different definitions. And a command object isn't necessarily bad. And I personally, I'm not necessarily anti-service objects in general, but what I've found in the Rails community over the last couple of years is people have this problem where our model code gets too bloated, it's too hard to understand. What's the solution? We don't have any good place to put this code. Where do we put it? Oh, there's this thing called service objects. We'll just put our code in service objects now. But I think it's a bit of a confused idea because in programming we have paradigms and we have patterns, and which one is a service object? I'm actually curious. What do you guys think? Oh, let me see this. This will be interesting. Who thinks service objects are a pattern? Okay, one person. Two or maybe who thinks it's a paradigm? Okay. And a lot of people apparently have no opinion on which one of the two it is. And I think the answer is we don't know. Like that's a question that hasn't really been, like who has, okay, let me ask this. Before, when I asked that question just now, who here has thought about that distinction for service objects before, whether it's a pattern or a paradigm? Yeah, I think most of people, a couple of hands there, but I think most of the people who use service objects haven't given that thought as to whether this is a paradigm or a pattern. Because a pattern is a solution to a specific kind of problem. Like a command pattern is, you would use that in a certain scenario when you have a certain type of problem. It fits that quite nicely. And a paradigm is, it's kind of a subjective choice, like object-oriented paradigm or functional paradigm, procedural paradigm, and it tends to be the case that you write your entire code base in just one paradigm because you make the choice at the beginning to use a certain paradigm and then you write everything that way. But service objects are kind of this weird thing that's neither one nor the other, and people treat it as a paradigm. So again, I'm not anti-service object. What I don't like to see is when people say, okay, we have this thing called service objects. This is just how we write our code now. Because it doesn't actually give you very much structure or, in my opinion, meaning. And what happens is you have the same crappy code that you had originally, and you haven't actually fixed anything. You've just moved the problem from one place to another. You have the same problem just in a different place, and then you have service objects calling other service objects, which in turn call other service objects. and you still have just as big of a mess. It's just in a slightly different structure. Side note, I'm not saying that it necessarily leads to that outcome. I'm sure it could be tidy with service objects. I'm just saying that service objects by themselves don't fix anything. And basically everything that I just said, I think also applies to interactors. Okay, so what is the solution? Just curious, has anybody in the audience arrived at something that they like? We talked about this problem where code accumulates in the models. Has anybody figured out something that they're happy with, that they feel like does a good job of organizing the model code? Yeah.
I've come to a personal conclusion that organizing my code with modules, simply Ruby modules or even raise concerns if necessary, is a nice way to use separation of concerns and to isolate specific business cases in the code while still being able to call the methods that you want directly from the instance of your model. Personally, I find the code more readable. I wouldn't abuse of that, but it's worked pretty well for me, and it's made the code more readable, and it helped me to avoid the pattern that you described, which is calling a service object that calls another, because at some point we always know from where to call the method. It's from the model. So the model is still fat because the list of the methods that are returned is huge, but when you read the code organized in files, you still have that benefit.
Okay. I'll repeat some of that because it probably doesn't come through on the recording and all that. So namespaces, modules and concerns. I said namespaces because for me that comes to mind also in connection with that. I'll make a couple comments on that, and I want to hear what other people had to say too. But first, a couple comments. In any piece of code, there's what's essential. There's the essential points, and there's the incidental details. And a lot of times in a model, you have, if you have like a big 800-line model or something like that, it's a mix of essential points and incidental details. And the incidental details distract from the essential points. The same thing came to mind when we were looking at that Tailwind code sample. I couldn't understand what that was about because I don't understand French. But what came to mind for me, because we had this piece of Tailwind code with all these really low-level details. And then there was some Ruby mixed in, maybe some conditionals and stuff like that. And the whole thing together was pretty hard to understand, I thought. And the thing that came to mind for me was that there are too many incidental details mixed into that piece of code, and you couldn't make out the essential point from it. So in any file, whether it's an HTML file, a Rails model file, Rails controller file, any file, you have the essential and the incidental. And to bring that back to what you said about concerns and modules, often I like to take a model file, and if there's an incidental detail that's distracting, I'll put that out into a separate model or concern. By the way, to me, module or concern. Module or concern, it's almost a distinction without a difference. Concern is kind of some syntactic sugar over a module. To me, it doesn't really matter a lot which one you use. It's the same purpose of getting that little bit of code out into a different place. A lot of people seem to consider concerns main use case to be for reuse. When you have something that's repetitive among multiple models, you can dry that up by having a concern. Most of my concerns, the vast majority, they're used only once because they're used just to get that incidental detail out of a model. Okay, that's all I wanted to comment on that. So I saw a couple more raised hands when I asked if anybody had some solutions they liked to this problem of bloated models. Yeah.
Well, to me, interactors was a good solution. I find I'm happy with what I've got, with both a mixture of interactor slash service objects and also describing some parts as what I call entities, models that are not active record models. To describe some parts like plain old Ruby objects that maybe have a larger scope than regular models, and yeah, interactors on the side to keep basically controllers and active record models to a minimum.
Okay, so interactors, service objects, and some poros, kind of a mix of those three things. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
We also had a mix. We also had a set of rules in which the models could not call domain objects or command objects or query objects. They would just interact with other models or other lower level.
Oh, interesting. You said you had a rule where models couldn't call. Sorry, say it again.
Yeah, models couldn't call something of a higher abstraction than Ruby and Rails itself.
Okay, models couldn't call something of a higher abstraction, but they could call something of a lower abstraction.
Yeah, so
Okay.
we had domain objects that would call models or use models, but not the other thing.
Got it.
As a software, we broke it all the time. But we tried to.
I see. Okay. Okay. Well, yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the ways that I like to structure Rails applications, and I want to get really almost philosophical for a minute and talk about what even is a model, because we have these things called models in our application, but in my experience, a lot of people think about what a model is in a different way from what I think a model is. So I want to invite you to forget about Rails and even forget about programming, and let's just talk really broadly what is a model. Because programmers aren't the only people who use models. Philosophers and mathematicians and scientists all use models. And so we're taking this really broad, really old idea and we're just applying it a little bit more narrowly and specifically. I found this on Wikipedia. If you look at the Wikipedia article for scientific modeling is a scientific activity, the aim of which is to make a particular part or feature of the world easier to understand, define, quantify, visualize, or simulate by referencing it to existing and usually commonly accepted knowledge. And kind of a model, in my own words, is a useful approximation to the truth. Because almost always when you're modeling something in Rails, you're not trying to create a totally faithful simulation. You're not trying to capture every detail of that thing. Like if you wrote a program for a pet store, for example, you wouldn't keep track of what do you care about for the pet? Maybe the name of the animal, the owner's animal, what kind of animal it is. But you're not going to have every single detail about, it's not a simulation. It's just we're keeping track of what we care about, and it's a useful approximation to the truth. And I'll give a couple other examples of models that people use all the time. Because everybody, regardless of your profession or whatever, we all have models that we use on a day-to-day basis. One example is scientists have a model of an atom, a mental model to make an atom easier to think about, where it has the nucleus and the electrons and stuff like that. We've all seen the diagram. I understand that atoms actually look quite a bit different from that in the sense that they're really far apart. Kind of like we have the model of the solar system and the planets are pretty close together, and we kind of think of the solar system in this simplified way, even though the planets are like, the scale is it's a way different scale. So it's not even a model that's totally truthful, but again, it's a useful approximation to the truth. It's true enough for our purposes that we need it for. Same thing with a tree. I have a mental model in my head of what a tree is and how a tree works. I don't understand every detail of how a tree, like, how does a tree like drink water and get the water up to the leaves and stuff? Like, I don't know. And that's stuff that I don't need to know. I don't care about it for my day-to-day interactions with trees. One more example, viruses. I have a mental model of what a virus is and how it works. I know that if somebody else is infected with a virus and they cough on me or something like that, it can make me sick, and then after a bit of time, I get better. There's a lot more that I could know about viruses, but I don't care. It's a useful approximation to the truth. So let's bring this back to programming. I took that definition of a scientific model and I modified it to apply to programming. Modeling is a programming activity, the aim of which is to make a particular part of a program easier to understand and work with by representing parts of reality in a simplified way that can be expressed in code. So when we think about Rails models, a lot of people have like an overly narrow conception of what a model is. It's like if we have 12 database tables in our application, then we have 12 models. It's this thing that's like very tightly tied to a database table. But there's absolutely no reason that that has to be the case. Everything you put in that app models folder, it doesn't have to have anything to do with active record. It can just be a plain old Ruby object. And a plain old Ruby object doesn't have to be any kind of object. It doesn't have to be some design pattern or something like that. It can just be an object. And regular old objects are very powerful, and you can do a lot with just regular old objects. Okay, so I've talked about what not to do. And usually, obviously, people want to hear, if you don't think we should do that, what do you think we should do? And that's a lot harder, because that's something that, like, there's no one single thing. It's a lot of small concepts that are learned over the course of years and years. But I can share some stuff. I can share some stuff about how I structure my applications. So, for one, I put a lot of my code in models. And where do I put my models? People have asked me, like, where do I put my poros in my Rails applications? I just put them in app models because I shared how I think of models. It's this very broad thing, and that's what I think of as going in the models folder. And then, like we talked about a little bit earlier, I like to organize so there's like the coarse grain level and the fine grain level. At the coarse grain level, I think about my folders. Like in the app models folder, I'll have namespaces for my various domain concepts broadly. And then I have nested namespaces because the reason for organizing code is to put things in the places that we're likely to look for them. And so it's common to organize code by design pattern, but I don't think that makes a lot of sense, because when you need to find, for example, some billing related code, how do you know whether that's an interactor or a factory or any of these other things? All you know is that it's the billing code. So I think it's better to organize things in terms of those domain-oriented namespaces. And then an important thing that I just want to repeat is the essential versus the incidental. Putting the essential points at the forefront while moving the incidental details somewhere else. Okay. These are things that I talk about a lot on my podcast and YouTube channel and stuff like that. So if this has piqued your interest and you want to hear more about this you can go to codewithjason.com, and I have links to all my stuff. There's one thing in particular I would recommend. I did this talk recently with Jorge Manrubia from 37 Signals. He's a really smart guy. He had a lot. Has anybody by chance seen that Vanilla Rails is Plenty post that he did? It was kind of making the rounds recently. Yeah, he and I talked about that. He's been on the podcast a couple times too. So if you're curious, you can go to codewithjason.com to find all that stuff. And then on Twitter, I'm at Jason Swett. Merci beaucoup.